Hi, I'm Andrew Connell. I'm an MVP for Office Servers and Services. And in this module, we're going to talk about building Android apps with the Microsoft Graph. There's multiple sections and demos to this module. So in this first section, we're going to build a native Java application using the Microsoft Graph in the SDK. Specifically, what we're going to cover is talking a little bit about the Microsoft Graph API and the native Android SDK. I'm going to talk about getting started with your new application, an overview on Android development, and then creating an Android application that we're going to eventually extend with Azure AD and the Microsoft Graph. Microsoft's Office 365 developer vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. As a developer, you can bring your applications into their user experience. So with over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your different applications, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your applications. There are currently 850 million events created a month and a total of 470 petabytes and more of data stored in the service that can add value to and for our users of your applications. So what does it look like to build an application that's going to be integrated with Office 365? Well, as you can see at the very bottom here, we've got access to a lot of different data sources inside of Office 365. And the best way to get to them is using the Microsoft Graph API. That Microsoft Graph API is going to essentially act as a proxy to all of these different services that are available to us. Now, in order to call the Microsoft Graph, we're going to have to first authenticate, and we're going to do that using Azure AD. And that's going to allow us to authenticate either using our consumer accounts, like a Microsoft account, or using our work and school account, or like an Azure AD based identity that we would use in Office 365. You also are going to be able to leverage the OpenID Connect, which is going to give us the ability to get some information about the currently logged on user. Now, once we are authenticated, we then have the option of many different ways that we can talk to the Microsoft Graph. And the way we're going to do that is using different environments. Now, in the case of this scenario, we're going to be looking at using Android Studio and working with a strong API SDK for the Microsoft Graph. And then we can build our application using anything else that we want to end up using here. So in this case here, we're going to build one that's going to show events from a calendar in Office 365. Now let's talk a little bit about authentication and how this works with the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph leverages Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD, like so many other cloud services from Microsoft. And this is going to provide authentication and authorization capabilities for our applications. You can create web apps as well as native apps with Azure AD apps. And in addition, users can authorize the application using the delegated consent, where they grant the application to act on their behalf. Global tenant admins can also grant consent to all users as a different type of consent. We call that the admin consent. Azure AD application authentication is implemented using the OAuth 2 protocol. So users are redirected to Azure for authentication credentials so that the custom applications never get the actual credentials of the user. We just redirect them over to Azure, and then Azure is going to give us back some information, or give the user some information that they will provide the application to log in. Depending on the authentication flow that we leverage, the app is ultimately going to get an access token that's only valid for a specific amount of time for a specific user with specific permissions and for a specific resource. In our case here, that's the Microsoft Graph. These access tokens can be refreshed after they expire using an associated refresh token. And the login process also supports multi-factor authentication and federated authentication that Microsoft's Azure AD supports. Now, native applications differ from web applications in a few different ways because first, they're multi-tenant by default, and you don't need to worry about sending app credentials or app secrets when the native app is distributed, because it can't contain a secret, because once you distribute the app, it's never really going to be a secret. So instead, we're going to use some special redirection URLs. Now, all Office 365 cloud services, including SharePoint Online and the Microsoft Graph, leverage Azure AD for authentication and authorization. And this means there is a single authentication flow that we're going to use for Office 365 applications, as well as those that are created to leverage the Microsoft Graph. Microsoft's OpenTech group provides a native Android SDK for the Microsoft Graph that is available on GitHub. Developers can leverage either the ADAL, which is the Azure AD v1 authentication endpoint, or the MSAL libraries, which is for the Azure AD v2 authentication endpoint, in their application, depending on the type of application that they're building. So ADAL stands for the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. MSAL is the Microsoft Authentication Library. What does the development story look like if we're building an Android-based native app? Well, developers can use Android Studio, which is a free IDE that's implemented on the IntelliJ platform. All application registration is going to be done using one of two different Azure management portals. And then we're also going to use a thing called Gradle, which is a build and package management tool that's commonly used in Android development. It's similar to using MS Build and NuGet in a .NET project. When should you consider doing a native Android application? Well, when you have a specific device capability that you want to take advantage of, or a complex user experience or visualization. Native is always going to be faster than and more performant than cross-platform based dev that may be a little bit simpler in some cases. Now, developers could also use a cross-platform option such as Xamarin or Cordova, which have their own advantages and disadvantages, but we're not going to get into that in this module. So let's look at what is involved in creating an Android native application. So the process of creating an Android native application is that I would recommend that you first create the application using Android Studio. And the second step is going to be to implement the user experience. So get a flow of how the application is going to work. Then the next step is going to be to extend the application to support authentication and token acquisition from Azure Active Directory. And once that's done, then we can use the tokens that we obtain to call the Microsoft Graph using the Android SDK that's provided from Microsoft. So let's look at what the steps here for this, and we'll see this when we do the demo in just a moment. So creating the application using Android Studio is the first step that you're going to do. And then you're going to implement the user experience. So here I've just created a sign-in button. And maybe I've done some other little UI experiments here where I've had, once you sign on, you would then be presented over to another screen that would let you click on a load events that would pull events from your Office 365 account. And I'm also popping up a little toast notification at the bottom, which is letting me know that someone was able to sign in. In this demo, we're going to see how to take an Android application and we're going to see the UI changes that we've made to it to support authentication and logging into Azure AD, and then showing a list of events from our calendar in Office 365. Now, as we talked about in that last section that we just went through, this is only covering the UI aspect to it. So we don't have any business logic that we're going to wire up to this or anything. And furthermore, in the interest of time, instead of walking through the entire process, the idea here is to look at the sample that we've built and what can we actually do with it, and what are the important pieces related to getting the application ready to run. If you would like to see how this application is built and go build it yourself, this screencast is actually part of a bigger training module, and there's an associated hands-on lab. And one of the exercises in the lab has you walk through and actually create the application that you see here. So every step along the way, you can go follow this on your own if you like, if you wish to do this. So the first thing we did after creating our application here is we've added in a couple dependencies here that we're going to need for our application. And specifically, if I come over here into the build.gradle file and I open this up, you'll see that we have this section here that has Guava and the JSON library that's here. So the JSON library, as we talked about in the slides, this is going to be used to handle some the deserialization and serialization of Java and JSON objects inside of Android, similar to the JSON.NET library that we use in a ASP.NET or in the .NET world that we're so familiar with. The Guava library is going to be used for some UI components as well. Now, if I come over here and I look at the content main, this is the UI for our application. So if I pop this up in the designer, you'll see here that we have it set up to where we have like this sign in button, and when we click sign in, then we're going to change the view here to show some other stuff. And so you can see how the layout is structured here. Instead of looking at all the XML, we have a sign in panel, we have a loading panel, and then we have an events panel. And we're going to show and hide those different panels based on the state of our application as we work through it. So this is one of the things that we first ended up setting up here. Now, if I come over here and look at our main activity, this is where most of our code is actually happening. So here's the stuff that I've added to it. Up here in this in the first section here, what I've done is I've created some private members here for the layout. So we have a layout panel for signing in for the events and loading the events. And then a little bit farther down, we're getting reference to each one of these once this view has been created. We also have some things like a sign-in button that's been set up for a click handler so that when that happens, when the listener detects a click that happens on our sign-in button, we're going to call our onSign-in method. And we have the same things that are set up for our loading event and our sign-out button here for these different buttons. So loading events and signing out, those are tied to these other methods. So for now, our sign-in button is simply going to put a toast message up that says, hello, whoever the user is. And we don't know who they are because we haven't done any of the authentication stuff just yet. And it's going to change the visibility of the panel. We have a sign out button, which we can do the same thing. That's going to effectively just change the visibility of the panel. And then when I click loading events, that's going to go load the events from our Office 365 calendar. So let's see this run. So I'm going to come over here and click this play button. And this is going to fire up our simulator here that we have. So I'll open up this device. Here we can see our application is loaded in the emulator. It's being cut off a bit by the screen here because it's a pretty big emulator. But I'm going to go ahead and click sign in, and we can see that we have our hello user toast message that shows up at the bottom. We have our load events method, and we have our sign out button. So I click sign out, should take me back to the main screen, sign in, load events, and we can see successfully loaded events. None of these things are wired up to anything important just yet, but we can see we have the general flow of our application. So the next step is to add authentication and the MSAL authentication library to it. So let's see how we do that. In this next section, we're going to look at building graph applications, but we're going to focus on the authentication piece. So we're going to look at the authentication overview. We're going to talk a little bit about Azure AD. We're going to talk about the app registration portal and then implementing the Microsoft authentication library in an Android native application. Now, the Microsoft Graph leverages Azure AD like so many other applications that we have out there. And we've already gone through a lot of the different topics here that I've already talked about in the previous section. We've already done that here on this slide. The key point here is that when you build for your authentication piece, you can use multiple different options for authentication. You can either use the Azure AD V1 endpoint or the V2 endpoint. And depending on which one you're going to use, it's going to also determine which SDK you can take advantage of that's offered from Microsoft. So if you're using the V1 endpoint, you're going to use the ADAL authentication library. However, the recommendation is to use the V2 endpoint. What the V2 endpoint is going to allow us to do is to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of defining permissions for dynamic consent and a couple other options as well. So the recommendation is to use the V2 endpoint and make your life easier by using the Microsoft Authentication Library. So let's talk a little bit about what the authentication story looks like here. So we've got our application that you see up there on the top left screen here. And what I've got is my end user who's down in the left, on the left side, who's going to be using my application that's up there on the top right or top left. So what I'm going to do is that my application is first going, when I say I want to log in, the application is going to redirect the user or send the user over to Azure AD, and it's going to ask them to authenticate. And what that's going to do is that's going to trigger, like in Android, it's going to trigger the browser to navigate over to the authentication endpoint for Azure AD. Now, I'm going to go through the authentication process. I may be prompted to grant consent to the application if I haven't done this before for specific permissions and resources that it's requesting. And then once that's done, the Azure AD is going to return control back to the native application, who is going to collect the response that came back from Azure AD and use that response to then go fetch an access token. So it's going to fetch that access token from Azure AD, and that access token is then going to give me the ability to call the different resources and endpoints that I requested when I went to authenticate for that endpoint. The key point here, though, is that my native application is never going to get the credentials of the user that's using the app. Instead, Azure AD you're going to send the user to Azure AD to go log in, and Azure AD is going to give that user some sort of a token or a code, and that code is a very short life code that then can be used by the application to fetch our access token. Now, let's talk a little bit about these endpoint versions that we have that are available to us. So I already mentioned a little bit about the V1 endpoint, but let's talk more about the V2 endpoint here. The challenge with the V2 endpoint is that it does introduce some breaking changes to the protocols, and this is why it's called a V2 endpoint, because the protocol is different and requires new client library implementations. It's going to present a converged authentication process, and what that means is that we can use a single library and a single endpoint to authenticate, but we can let users log in using their consumer or Microsoft account or their Office 365 or otherwise known as work and school account. So it's kind of like a proxy over both of those different authentication endpoints. It's going to enable the same code for using the Microsoft Graph for using things like reading mail and retrieving contacts if I'm using the consumer services like OneDrive Consumer or OneDrive for Business, or Outlook.com's email and contacts offering and calendaring, or Office 365's contacts and calendar and emailing offering. I talked already a bit earlier about the dynamic consent. So what this is giving me the ability to not have to define the permissions up front when I register the application and force the user to then go through the entire process of accepting all the permissions and consenting to all the permissions as an all or nothing proposition. Instead, my application can request permissions at runtime from Azure AD, and if the user hasn't granted those permissions, then Azure AD will prompt the user to grant those permissions at that time. So some of the key improvements from V1 or V2 to V1 for the authentication endpoint. In the V1 endpoint, we had to provide a resource parameter to identify which resource that we were requesting an access token to. And unfortunately, open source libraries were not able to easily incorporate that into their requests. So now we use a scope parameter, which is supported by all libraries, to compound the resource and the permission at the same time. Now, when you build your applications with Azure AD V1, you had to register what permissions the application needed, and the user had to consent to all of those things up front, or otherwise known as statically consenting to them, as I mentioned in the last slide. But with V2, you can now send scopes that you want at the time you want them. You don't need to ask them for all the stuff up front. The changed contents of an ID token has been made in V2 to better conform to the OpenID Connect 1.0 specification, such as using the preferred username claim instead of something just called UPN, because UPN was more of a Microsoft-centric thing, but it wasn't as much of a standard. Also in the past, if you needed a client app, a single page app, a web API, maybe a native one, you had to create multiple app registrations and wire up relationships between them, which was a bit of a challenge. But the V2 endpoint now enables one app registration for a single logical application. So it's going to allow us to create multiple platforms or add multiple platforms to a single app registration. So let's talk a little bit about the SDKs, as I mentioned earlier. As there are changes in the protocols between V1 and V2 for Azure AD, it required a change in the SDK to a new conceptual model. we have this thing called a public client application, and that's going to use the registered application ID. You also have a confidential client application that's got a secret. So it's going to be either a client secret, like a password, or an X509 certificate. Now, the Microsoft Authentication Library is considered as the successor to Azure AD Authentication Library, otherwise known as ADAL. This module is going to focus on leveraging MSAL and Azure AD v2 endpoints to talk to the Microsoft Graph. So we have a couple different ways that we can register our applications. Azure AD gives us two different options or UI options for registering apps. The Azure AD portal is used for apps that are leveraging the V1 authentication endpoint, while the app registration portal is used for the V2 application endpoint. You're going to self-select yourself into one of these based on the endpoint that we're going to use. So for instance, because in this module, we're going to use the V2 endpoint, that means we have to use the Microsoft Authentication Library, which means we also have to use the app registration portal for creating our application. For Microsoft Graph apps, it's recommended to use the V2 endpoint, as I've said before. So you're going to use the app registration portal. You're going to first create the application, which is, think of it more as like registering the application. When I say create, I don't mean like you're going to an IDE and creating a code base just yet. You're just simply registering the application for use inside of Azure protected resources. Once I've created the application or registered the application, I'm going to obtain a copy of the app ID that's going to be presented. And this is going to come across as a GUID. This is the unique ID for our application. I'm then going to go down to the platforms section and I'm going to add a new native application and add the necessary permissions if I want to define them up front, or at least the minimal permissions that are required. So let's talk about implementing Azure AD authentication for Android applications here. The Azure AD team provides an Android SDK for native Android applications, and you're going to add this to your project using Gradle. So Gradle is a build and package management tool that is commonly used in Android development. It's similar to MS Build and NuGet if you're working in a traditional .NET-based project. Now, you're also probably going to want to add in a library called Volley. And this is a very popular Android library that helps you do some HTTP networking stuff that's going to be leveraged inside of our application. So in this first demo, what we need to do is we're going to need to create an Azure AD native application. And we're going to do it using the application registry portal. So you're going to get to the app registry portal by going to apps.dev.microsoft.com. And I want to log in with either a personal account, like a Microsoft account, or a work and school account. So I've already navigated to that page. And so I'm going to log in here with my login. And this is going to take me to a list of all my applications. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new application here. And I'll just call this my test native application. And I'll go ahead and click create. Now, once I click create here, the first thing that I want to make sure that I do is I'm going to want to scroll down and grab this application ID because I'm going to need this in my application. So I'm going to copy this and I'm just going to paste that somewhere that I can use later. Now, the next thing I'm going to need to do, because it's a native application, is I need to go create a new platform. So I'm going to scroll down here to platforms and click platforms and then click the native application. Now, it's going to give me this custom redirect URL. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I might not need it though, depending on the kind of application I'm creating. But some of them only need this ID right here and they can craft the rest of it. And that ID is, as you can see, the exact same ID as my application ID, a little bit higher up here. Now, I don't need to go through and specify my permissions. That's something that I can request dynamically with the dynamic consent. But just to show you how to go about doing that, I'm going to click on add and I'm going to look for the calendars .read permission right here and select it and then click OK. And I'm doing that for the Microsoft Graph based permissions that I'm going to go collect here. So once that's all done, everything is finished. I'm ready to go. And so I can just go ahead and click save. And with this, I now have a new Azure AD application that's been configured for working with a native application. Now in this demo, we want to see how to take an existing application and how we've configured it to add in the Microsoft authentication library and to handle authentication and stuff like that for having our native Android app actually log in and be used to log in to Office 365 and Azure AD. So the first step I did was to go in and modify this Gradle file here. And what I did is I added in this entry that we see listed right here. And what I'm doing is I'm adding in the Microsoft Identity Client, the Microsoft Authentication Library. And I'm also going to set up these two other excludes here to make sure that we don't have any conflicts with other libraries that are there. So I'm just saying, go ahead and load in this file or this library into our application. I've also added in a reference to Volley, which is a HTTP networking utility library that's pretty common for use inside of Android applications here. And now after I did that, I then went into the menu and I synced my Gradle files to download everything. And that's like the equivalent of, inside of a .NET application, I used NuGet to install the package, and then I kind of did a package restore to go download everything. I then came up here in the manifest. And I had to change some things in this in order for my Android application to support going out to go log in to some other, to open the browser up to get permissions to go out and access the internet and the network. So here I added in 2 user permissions for internet access and accessing the network state. And then I added in this other activity that we see down here a little bit farther down. And what this is going to do is this is going to allow the MSAL library to use the browser to prompt the user to authenticate to Azure AD. One of the things I have to do, as you see here in this scheme that we've listed down here for the data, is I have to change and put in the ID of my application that I had previously created in the app registration portal for my native application here. Now, the next thing that I did is I went in and created a little constants thing. So let's save our changes to that. I created a constants here, and this is going to give us a place to post in the different scopes that we're going to request permissions for, as well as our client ID. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in right here as well. Now, the next thing that we're going to end up doing is, now that I've created this, I've added in these different constants here. The next piece that I want to end up doing is I want to add an interface to declare a new callback type that I'm going to use in my application. So that's what this MSAL authentication callback is. And so I defined a few different methods. I have an MSAL auth success, I have an auth error, and an auth cancel. And you'll see how we're going to use that in just a few minutes. Now that I've done that, the next thing I'm going to do is create an authentication controller. Now, this is something I like to use because to make my authentication a little bit easier and to abstract it away from the rest of the application here. So with this, you'll see a couple different things that are interesting. I've got, it's a singleton, so I've got a method here called getInstance, and that's either going to create a new instance of my controller, or it's going to get an existing, it's either going to create a new instance or it's going to get the existing instance. And if I don't have an existing one when I'm creating a new one, I'm then also going to check and see if I have a public client application, which is a MSAL thing, to log in and to get this to work with my application. So here's my static instance that I've defined right up here. And also I have a static public instance for MSAL. Now, the interesting part down here is when we get into acquiring a token. So here you can see I'm passing in that callback that I've defined earlier. And I'm going to say, here's the callback. And then I'm going to go specify right here to go acquire the token, passing in the current activity, which is the main activity that we're going to use, the scopes of permissions we want, and I'm also going to go over here and call this function called getting an interactive callback. And what this is going to do is implement a couple different methods. So when we have a successful return result from Azure AD, then I want to take the result and I want to check and see, do we have a callback that was defined? Which you see up here, I already grabbed a copy of it when we called do acquire token. So when this is successful, this method's going to run. And then down here, I'm checking to see, do I already have the callback? And if I do, then go call his method on MSAL success and path in the result. So we'll see how we use that in just a minute. Now the next thing we're going to do, if I go over here to my main activity, I added in the interface. I said that this activity is not only going to inherit from another activity, the app compat activity, but it's also going to extend or implement the interface of the callback that I defined. And so effectively what that does then is that now if I scroll down here, I had to go in and implement a few different events for my on success. So we have an on success, and then we have an on auth errors and cancels. But when the authentication is successful, I want to get this authentication result, and then I'm just going to say, go get the user. And then I'm going to write out a little toast message to display who the user is by getting their name and their displayable ID. And that's this user object right here. That's an MSAL object that we got because we also requested a OpenID connect scope as well. So we got an extra token where some extra information came back from us. And this method is being called on a successful authentication because when we actually tell it we want to log in, so if I come up here to my sign in method, I got an instance of my app controller, and then I specified the get instance for this. I specified that I wanted it to use this main activity, right? So if I look at this where it has, I'm specifying my main activity, which is the this object where I'm on. If you go back, remember where we were with our authentication controller, when I'm creating a new instance of it and passing in the context, we're saving the context, which is the activity itself, so that later when I come down here and call the do acquire token, which if we come back and look at the code for that in our main activity, so do acquire token, I'm passing in this activity, and the current activity is also my callback because it implements those different methods that we had, I showed you a moment ago for the MSAL success, auth error, and auth cancel. So that way, when the controller, again, when I call the do acquire token, I'm getting the callback, acquiring the token, and then the callback over here is saying, here's the stuff that I want you to do. On success, did you already have a callback that you got access to? Yes, I did. So go call on the auth success method, which is mapping back on the activity here to this method right here, which is going to change the visibility, set the little toast message, and also by getting the user information as well. There's one extra little step that you need to do here that can trip you up, is you need to implement this interface or this method on your activity called the activity result. And what this is doing is it's effectively when the browser, when we say we want to sign in and we send the request over to the browser to go take the user to the Azure AD authentication endpoint, once they log in, when the application then sends it back, sends the control back to our application, we need to have a way to trap that in our application so that we can get control again and hand the information that came back to the Microsoft Authentication library. And so here I'm saying when the result happens, I'm checking to see, do I already have a reference to the authentication controller? And if I don't, then I'm going to get a reference to it. Or if I don't already have it, I'm going to get a reference to it. I'm just going to say handle the redirect, and I'm passing in the request code, the result code, and the data that came back from that entire thing from the browser. So that's how everything's getting wired up together. And so we can see this run. If I come back over here and I start the application, we'll see the application load. I click sign in, and that should take me to a browser where I can then log in. So I've already tried this once, so I'm going to select that. And you can see here that it's listing out my name and my ID to show that I've already signed in. And I can go ahead and click sign out, and that would actually sign me out. Click sign in, and it'll take me back to the login page as well to sign back in. So the sign out worked. If I came over here and looked at sign out, I got a reference to my controller, and then I just selected the sign out method. And that sign out method on our controller simply removed the user that was currently signed in, and then I reset the instance, which effectively just deleted the current instance, so I'd have to recreate it and redo the authentication prompt. So that's all that we needed to do to set up our application to use MSAL in an Android app. The next step is to integrate the Microsoft Graph SDK. So let's see how we do that. So at this point, we've created our Android application. We've registered it with Azure AD using the app registration portal. We've implemented the UI, and we've also extended our application to support login with Azure AD. Now it's time to actually call the Microsoft Graph. And so in this section, we're going to integrate the Microsoft Graph Android SDK into our application. So specifically what we're going to cover is the Android SDK. We're going to talk about the Graph Services client and then also how to go about making requests. So the first step is to obtain the Microsoft Graph Android SDK. Developers can leverage the Graph REST API in any kind of an application because all it requires is just standard HTTP requests. So you can check out the Android HTTP library Volley, as I mentioned in the last section, for these different use cases. But Microsoft, as I've said, also provides a native Android SDK for the Microsoft Graph. And this is going to abstract the details away of working with the REST API. And it's also going to provide us a Fluent API for creating requests. So you can see from the little snippet that I have there on the slide that once I've got my client, I'm just calling get me, get events, and then I'm building a request up to add things to the query string. That's going to be the equivalent of going to the /me/events and then add on a couple select and a top and a skip parameters on my request to control how much data is coming back to me. So how do we integrate the Microsoft Graph into our Android applications? So just like the Azure AD MSAL Android SDK, the Graph team gives us an Android SDK for native Android applications. You're going to add this to your project using Gradle. So again, we've already talked about what Gradle is. And then I would also recommend that you add the JSON library, which is an open source library to help with serialization and deserialization of Java and JSON based objects. You can think of this as like the Newtonsoft or JSON.NET that we have inside of a .NET project. Now, depending on the size of the application, you may need to enable this thing called ProGuard and multi-indexing in your project. And if you look at the notes on for the Graph SDK for Android and GitHub, if you just go to the homepage for it that we've already mentioned earlier, you'll see reference to that in the documentation. And the reason for that is because due to the fact that the Android SDK for the Microsoft Graph uses a very large number of classes to describe the functionality, you may end up having to configure the app to be built in a certain way. It's a very simple process. Just refer to the documentation on how to best do that. And it may not apply depending on who you're targeting with your Android application as well, because later versions of the SDK have all this stuff taken care of for you. So my recommendation to you is to consider using a Singleton to manage calls to the Microsoft Graph endpoints. Most applications are only going to need a single instance of the Graph Service client for calling the Microsoft Graph. So to simplify this process, consider creating a Singleton to manage this process for you. Now, just keep a note that you're going to need to override requests that are sent and access to add the access token to the request using the authentication provider authenticate request method that's provided. And you can see that there on the slide where I'm actually updating the bearer token in the request. And then the next step is just to use the SDK. So calling the Microsoft Graph with the Graph Service client object is very straightforward. You're going to use the Fluent API to build the request. You're going to do that using the build request method that's going to allow you to add options to the OData query that's going to be sent to the resulting REST API. And for those of you who are new to Android development, Android uses a set of objects with the word future in their name in terms of callbacks. For example, this code uses a thing called a settable future, which is, think of it as very similar to like the async and await pattern in .NET or in promises in JavaScript and in TypeScript. Now, the last step that we have in this last demo is to integrate the Microsoft Graph into our application and go get some data from Office 365. We already have an application that is authenticated into Azure AD and is working just fine. So now we gotta see what we've done to update the application to call the Microsoft Graph. And again, just like the other samples here, this is the one that was already built as the result of a hands-on lab exercise. So if you'd like to see how to build it yourself, go check out the lab exercise associated with this module. But I'm going to walk through all the pieces of things that I did to actually make this work, starting with the Azure AD application. So the first thing that we had to do is I had to go in and I had to go grab the Gradle install for the Microsoft Graph. And so what I did is down here, you'll see a new implementation reference where I'm getting the Microsoft Graph SDK for the native Android here. So once I did that, you make a change to this file and you're gonna get a little prompt, or I just went to the file menu and said sync the project with the Gradle files, and that restored or downloaded the Graph SDK into my project. Now the next thing I did was I wanted to go get a singleton or create a singleton for working with the graph, because I find it you're only going to have one in your application, so I might as well create something that's going to make my life a little bit easier. So what I've done is I have two things. I have a Microsoft Graph Service Client Manager and a controller. So the controller is the one that I really want to use, but the Client Manager is what we're going to use to create a new instance of the Graph service. So here, again, I've set this up to where I have my Client Manager right here. So there's my static instance of this, as well as passing in a context. And you see here, the only thing that's really interesting about this is that when I call the method get graph service client, or passing it in an authentication provider, if I don't pass one in, then I use the one that I'm going to implement here. So I'm just going to call this method here of getting the graph service. And what that's going to do is call this guy down here, which is going to pass in an authentication provider, which is, again, it's this authentication provider. What this is a thing from MSAL. And what I've done is I've overridden a single method that it requires you to override that is simply going to add in the authorization header with the bearer token from our authentication controller. We're going to get that and add that to every single request. So we're going to authenticate calling the Microsoft Graph. So then here I've got my Graph service client. What it's going to do is check to see, do I have one? And if not, I'm going to go ahead and create one by saying create it with an authentication provider. And then it's got this method of calling a builder to create it from config, and I pass in the client configuration, which is what I got from the authentication provider. And then I said build the client. So that's going to give me back my Graph client, and I'm going to hand that back to the caller. So let's come over here and let's look at the controller that we've created. So here's my controller, and what this controller is going to do is that when I create a new instance of this controller, it's going to go get a reference to that Graph client using that client manager that we just looked at a minute ago. So now I've got a Graph client. I can use this inside of my application. Well, it's really simple to actually call this. All I'm going to do is have a new method here called getEvents. My getEvents is going to create a new request by saying graphclient.getme.getEvents. And I'm going to build a request by passing in these three parameters to just get specific fields and only get the first 20 items that it finds. I'm going to issue the request, so call request.get. It's going to give me back a callback, and when it succeeds, I'm going to go get the current page of results and create those as a list of events. And I'm simply going to enumerate through, or this is just creating a new response actually. And then I'm going to enumerate through the list of all the events that we got back, and I'm going to add them to my events collection here. That I have an events collection that we're going to use here. And you see here at the top of the method, I've created this result at the very top. What this result is this settable future is like resolving a promise in Java or in Android. So I've gone through and I've just grabbed all of the subjects and I've added them to, as the strings, added them to this event object, and then I'm just saying result.set events. So there's my result, and I'm just setting it to all the events that we just got back. And here's my event array I was looking for a moment ago. So this is I created just an array of strings that is called events, and I'm just going to be adding a bunch of strings to it and handing that back. Now, how do we use this in the UI? Well, what I then did is I went back to my main activity and I came down here to my load events method and I implemented my load events method. So when you click the load events method, it's going to go get a reference to our graph controller, which handles all the authentication behind us. It is then going to call a progress dialog to show that I'm loading the first 20 events. I'm going to go call get events by getting this settable future. And then I'm going to say futures.add callback, which it looks like this has been deprecated since we actually rolled this out. But it still works, so we're going to keep using it for now. I'm going to pass in the events and then just say pass in a new future callback, which is an array of strings, and say that when we succeed on this, when this whole thing runs, when you get all of these events back and when it's finished, I'm going to switch over to the UI thread, show a toast message on the current activity that says I loaded all of them successfully, and then I'm just going to bind the events by passing in the result object that we got back. And this bind events is just set down here, where all I'm doing is I'm simply setting the visibility of the pane that's going to show the last one, which is the one that shows all of our events. I'm going to get an array adapter, and I'm simply going to go to the list events, and that's the, we got to reference that earlier if you recall from an earlier demo. We have a panel called list events, and we got a reference to it in the UI when we initialize our application. So I went to the list events object, which this is a list view, and I just said set the adapter equal to this adapter we just created, and it knows how to adapt the results that came back into our list. And so let's see this run. If I come over here and I click the play button to build our application and send it over to the simulator, let's first sign out. Let's try this again. There we go. So it just closed it and then opened a new one. We had our old one still running. So I'm going to go ahead and click sign in. It'll take me over to Azure AD to log in. So I'll go ahead and log in. Shows that I'm here, and now I'm going to click load events. So load events should go fetch data, should show a toast message that we're fetching events, should go get data from Office 365, add it to the view, and then show a toast message that we got it. And ta-da, there it is. We've got our events. We see our toast message of loading event success, and I can just scroll through all the events that we have here. Right? I can go back to the main of our application. And so with that, we saw how to create an application here that has all of our, we can log in using Azure AD. We can then go use the Microsoft authentication library in our application to handle the login, handle the response that comes back. And then we can use that to obtain an access token and then use the Microsoft Graph native Android SDK to get a list of events coming from our Office 365 calendar. And with that, that brings us to the end of this module. I hope you learned something from creating an Android application and using the MSAL Android SDK as well as the Microsoft Graph Android SDK. This module or this screencast is part of a bigger module. Each of the demos that were presented inside of this session here or this screencast, they all have associated hands-on labs that you'll find with this module as well. And they walk you through all of the steps from creating the project and registering it and such that we weren't able to show in the entire demo just in the interest of time. So if you want to go through and build this yourself and get to the resulting input or results from the application that you saw in the demos, you can go check out the hands-on labs, the exercises. So thank you very much, and I hope you learned something.